What do you do when someone who believes they're untouchable crosses the wrong person? It started with the gate. I had been battling with the HOA for months. First, it was the fence that didn't meet community standards. Then, it was the color of the shutters. Every little thing seemed to set them off. But I wasn't about to bow to a group of control freaks who thought they could dictate my life. Especially not when the HOA president, Karen, was the one pulling the strings. Karen always carried herself with that air of superiority, the type of person who spoke as though her word was law, as though she could control every aspect of life in the neighborhood. It didn't matter that the community was made up of diverse people with diverse needs. To Karen, there was only one way things should be done, and that way was her way. The first couple of times, I thought it was just an annoyance. She would send me letters, the usual threats about violating the standards, but I let it slide. I was busy, I was a judge, and I didn't have time for these petty fights. But then came the fines. For everything. My garden was too wild for her taste, the mailbox didn't fit the community's aesthetic, and of course my fence, apparently. It wasn't up to community standards. It would have been easy to just give in and pay, let her win, but something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to bow to anyone. Not her. Not the HOA. Not when I had no legal ground to stand on. The more I ignored her, the more she pushed. And then, everything escalated. It wasn't just a letter or a fine this time. This time, they took things further. Much further. It was my son's 4th birthday. I just come home from one of the toughest days at work. Days where the weight of people's problems, the cases, the decisions that would impact lives had taken everything out of me. I was exhausted. All I wanted was to walk through the door, see my family, and celebrate my son's special day. Instead, I was met with something that knocked the wind right out of me. I pulled into the driveway, thinking I was coming home to the familiar sight of balloons and cake. But instead, I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the bright orange seal on my front gate. My mind was slow to process it at first, and then it hit me. I walked closer, the smell of fresh paint on the seal still lingering in the air. There it was clearly marked. Property sealed for violation of HOA regulations. No entry allowed until further notice. I didn't believe it. Not now. Not today. I stepped closer, my fingers trembling as I ran them over the cold metal of the gate. My son was inside. My wife and my 75-year-old grandmother, who had been living with us for the past few years, was there too. They were all inside, celebrating his birthday, and now this? The realization hit me harder than any case I'd ever judged. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was an attack. The worst part? Karen had chosen this day. The day of my son's birthday. The day I'd come home after a grueling day at work. The day my grandmother, frail and delicate, should have been resting peacefully in our home, not being evicted. The timing was cruel, almost deliberate. I turned, looking at the sealed gate one more time. There was no question in my mind anymore. Karen had crossed a line. She thought she could push me around, that she could dictate the terms of my life. But she hadn't just crossed a line this time. She had made a critical mistake. I wasn't just some tired, frustrated homeowner, overwhelmed with the pressures of daily life. I wasn't just someone who would sit back and let this happen. I was the state's top judge, and Karen had no idea who she was messing with. The anger was there, yes. But more than that, I felt something else, a calm resolve. I stood there for a moment, letting the chaos of the day settle. Then I took a slow, deliberate breath and smiled to myself. This wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The next few hours were a blur of anger and disbelief. I stood there, staring at the sealed gate for what felt like an eternity, trying to comprehend how this could have happened. It wasn't just about the fence, the mailbox, or the garden anymore. This was about control, about Karen asserting her power over my life and my family. Inside, I could hear the laughter of my son, the clinking of birthday party decorations, and my grandmother's soft voice. It made my stomach turn. This was supposed to be a day of celebration, of joy. Instead, Karen had turned it into a nightmare. My instincts screamed for action, but I couldn't let my emotions dictate how I moved forward. I had to be careful. If I let anyone know about what was happening too soon, it could cause unnecessary panic. My wife was already stressed. My 75-year-old grandmother, who had been in and out of the hospital recently due to heart issues, didn't need this kind of shock. I couldn't risk her having another health episode. So I made a decision. I couldn't confront this head-on just yet, not in the state the family was in. Instead, I had to move in silence. I didn't want to spoil the celebration mood, especially for my son. His 4th birthday meant the world to me, and I refused to let Karen take that away. So I slipped around to the back of the house, avoiding the sealed gate, and entered through the back door. There, sitting in the hallway, was the surprise gift I had bought for my son, a shiny, brand new bicycle. His face would light up when he saw it. I couldn't wait to see him ride it for the first time. For a moment, I let myself be caught up in the excitement of the day, imagining the joy on his face as he took it for a spin. But reality quickly set back in. I had a much bigger issue to deal with. The HOA's illegal actions needed to be handled, and I needed a plan. There was no way I was letting them disrupt our lives. I couldn't stay in the house with the property sealed, especially with my grandmother's health at risk. My immediate goal became clear. I needed to get my family to a safe place, somewhere out of sight, while I secretly figured out how to resolve this. I quickly grabbed my wife and told her we needed to head to a nearby hotel for the night. "We need a little break just for tonight," I said, keeping the tone light, not wanting to give away the gravity of the situation. I could tell she was confused, but she trusted me. My son was busy playing with his friends, unaware of the chaos brewing outside. And my grandmother? Well, she didn't need to know about the mess just yet. But before we could leave, the unthinkable happened. As we were about to step out the door, I heard a knock at the front. My blood ran cold. I looked out the window and saw a man standing by my front gate, clipboard in hand. He wore a uniform that vaguely resembled an HOA worker, but something about him seemed off. This wasn't a regular maintenance guy or a neighbor enforcing the rules. I knew what this was, an official attempt to intimidate me. I opened the door cautiously, trying to keep things under control. The man immediately stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "You're being evicted, sir," he said, his tone cold and authoritative, like he had all the power in the world. "You and your family have been in violation of HOA regulations. We're here to take action." I was in shock. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "You can't just evict my family. You can't even. Property has been sealed," he interrupted, "and you're being charged for breaking community law. This isn't the first time we've had issues with your property. The HOA has had enough." I felt my chest tighten. This was a joke. They had no right to do this. Karen had pushed this too far, but I needed to keep it together. "We're leaving now," I said firmly, glancing back at my wife and son, still packing their things in confusion. "This is absurd. You can't just barge in and start issuing orders. You've overstepped, and I'll make sure the HOA is held accountable for this." He took a step forward, clipboard raised, ready to write more down. "You're being officially charged. The HOA has decided that." I cut him off, my voice steady but firm. "I'll be contacting the authorities. You have no legal right to do this, and you'll find out very quickly that I'm not someone you want to mess with." He froze for a moment, clearly taken aback by my confidence. I wasn't some powerless homeowner caving into her rules anymore. I had been preparing for this. Karen didn't know it, but this was the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment I'd make sure the law worked in my favor. The situation had become far more complicated than I had initially realized. At first, I thought Karen's actions were just the result of petty power struggles and her obsession with controlling the neighborhood. But as I dug deeper, I started to uncover something that made my blood run cold. I had assumed that Karen's fixation on my property was simply part of her grand plan to exert power over everyone. But it wasn't just about the fence or the garden. It was about something much bigger, something personal. I spent the morning in the hotel room, pacing and piecing things together. I went over the conversation with Alex, knowing that he was on the case. He had promised to look into Karen's financial dealings, but I realized that wasn't the key to this case. No, it was Karen's past that I needed to uncover. The breakthrough came when I visited a local records office, searching for more details about my property. I needed to see if the legal filings could provide a clue. It was a public record, so there was no reason I couldn't access it, but I wasn't expecting what I found. There, buried deep in the records was an old foreclosure notice, one that had been issued years ago. The name on the document stopped me cold: Karen's parents. My mind raced as I realized what I was looking at. Karen's parents had once owned the house I was living in, but things hadn't gone smoothly. In fact, the house had been foreclosed on because Karen's parents couldn't keep up with the mortgage. A few months after the foreclosure, they fled the country, no doubt to escape mounting debts and legal issues. But what struck me even harder was the fact that the house was now my property. The legal transfer had been smooth enough, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this was no coincidence. What if Karen hadn't just been trying to push me around? What if she was trying to get her hands on this house? I wasn't sure yet how far she was willing to go, but I knew this. Karen wasn't about to let go of the property so easily. She had probably been scheming for years to reclaim it. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Karen had been leveraging the HOA's influence to get what she wanted. And it wasn't just about my property. She had a history of using the HOA to push people out of their homes. One name kept coming up in the records: Samantha Rogers, a neighbor who had been forced out of her home after the HOA imposed absurd fines on her, claiming she had violated zoning laws. Her property had been nearly seized under questionable circumstances, and I began to suspect that Karen had used the same tactics against others. I started talking to a few residents in the neighborhood, and it wasn't long before the stories began to pile up. Yeah, Samantha fought back, one neighbor told me, but the HOA wouldn't back down. They sent her notice after notice, until eventually she had no choice but to sell. No one could afford to fight them. It's like the whole neighborhood's in their grip. Another neighbor had a similar tale, this time about a couple who had lived here for years, but were suddenly faced with an influx of fines and bogus violations. They didn't have the money to contest it, the neighbor explained, and before they knew it, they were out of their house. All because the HOA found some small thing they could use to ruin their lives. I don't know how they did it, but Karen was always involved. I was beginning to connect the dots. Karen had been using the HOA to crush anyone who stood in her way, and the reason for that was clear now. It wasn't about some petty neighborhood rule enforcement. It wasn't about her needing control. It was about money. She wanted the property back, and she had been using the HOA to manipulate people, force them out of their homes, and take over properties she couldn't get legally. I couldn't let her get away with it. I started gathering everything I could. I reached out to the neighbors who had been forced out, requesting any evidence they had. I went to the court records, finding every case of someone who had been victimized by the HOA under Karen's rule. Each person had been pushed to the brink, forced to sell, forced to leave, all because they couldn't afford to fight the HOA's corrupt tactics. I wasn't just fighting for my home anymore. I was fighting for justice, for everyone Karen had wronged. This wasn't just about property. It was about taking down a corrupt system that had destroyed lives. I had the evidence now, and I wasn't going to let her win. The more I uncovered, the more determined I became. Karen thought she could manipulate the system and take what wasn't hers, but she hadn't counted on me. She had no idea who she was messing with. It was becoming clear now. Karen wasn't just playing the game. She was running it. Every turn, every misstep from her only brought me closer to uncovering how deeply she'd buried her claws into this community. The more I found, the more disgusted I became. Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She was a manipulator, a woman with a deeply rooted agenda, and she had used her position to destroy lives and claim what wasn't hers. I had spent the last few days pulling all the strings together. I had been collecting testimonies from victims who had been manipulated by the HOA's false claims, their savings drained by fines and bogus charges. I could almost hear Karen's voice now, cold and calculating as she issued threats and promises of community harmony. The truth, however, was that it was all about money. Money she thought she could steal from others to fill her own pockets. Money she had convinced herself she deserved because of some misplaced sense of entitlement. The next breakthrough came when Alex sent over his findings. He had been digging through public records and speaking to some old contacts, and what he found shocked me even more. Karen's parents were deep in debt, Alex said over the phone. Her father was a gambler, and her mother? Well, she wasn't any better. They borrowed heavily, ran up debts they couldn't repay. Eventually, they lost everything. And once they were about to lose the house, they just fled the country, left it all behind. I felt my heart sink as I processed the news. So, this was about more than just the house. It was about Karen's desperation, the shame of her family's financial ruin, and the need to reclaim what was lost. The house, the property, her parents' legacy, she had been plotting to get it back for years, and I had just been the next obstacle in her way. I knew there was more to her obsession with this house. I muttered, pacing the hotel room. She's not just playing the HOA game for power. She's trying to get back what her family lost. Exactly, Alex agreed. She's been using the HOA to push people out, to manipulate the system, so she could take back that property. And she's been successful, until now. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. Karen's manipulation wasn't just about control. It was about her own shameful past. Her family's financial ruin, her father's debts, and her mother's neglect of their property had all led her to this point. And now, she was using the HOA to get what she thought she deserved. I wasn't about to let her take my home or the homes of others just because of her greed. The next day, I took the first steps to end this nightmare. I didn't go to the HOA office, and I didn't bother with a direct confrontation that would only give Karen a chance to twist things. No, I was taking this straight to court. I had been collecting everything I could: emails, letters, testimonies from other victims, and records of Karen's actions. It was all there. I knew I had a solid case. Karen might have thought I was just some regular homeowner she could push around, but she was wrong. I wasn't just a person she could bully. I was going to make sure she felt the full weight of the law. When the day finally came, I stood before the judge, not in a courtroom as a defendant, but as the plaintiff. I was pressing charges against Karen and the HOA for illegal eviction and property seizure. The room was quiet as the judge called the case to order. Karen entered the courtroom, her usual confident stride replaced by uncertainty. She glanced around, clearly surprised to see me standing there, not as a homeowner, but as the one filing the case against her. She didn't know what was coming. In fact, she hadn't known anything about me, who I was. The moment she laid eyes on me, her face went pale. You're the one suing?" she asked, her voice faltering. I smiled inwardly, keeping my expression calm. I'd already filed everything, prepared my case, and presented the undeniable evidence. All she had was her manipulative ways and a house she didn't deserve. The jury was going to see through her lies. "That's right, Karen," I replied, calmly holding up the stack of documents. "You've manipulated this community, destroyed lives, and tried to take what wasn't yours. You're not getting away with this." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but I wasn't listening. This was no longer about pleading with her or begging for reason. This was about exposing her for the fraud and the liar she was. The evidence was in front of us. Karen's history with the HOA, her attempt to seize my property, the other residents she'd driven out, all of it was right there. The case wasn't going to take long. In fact, I was confident it would be over quickly. But I knew the real satisfaction would come when she realized the truth. "You'll pay for your actions," I said softly, almost to myself, knowing the words would cut through her defenses. "And you'll face the consequences for everything you've done to this community." The courtroom was tense as the judge called the session to order. Karen sat there, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, I saw her fidgeting, a clear sign that she didn't have the control she was so used to having. She thought she could manipulate the situation, push me out, and continue running the HOA like a private kingdom. But today, she would see how wrong she was. The judge called for the opening statements, and Karen's lawyer stood up first, trying to assert that my case was baseless, just a personal vendetta. His words were smooth, calculated, but they lacked substance. I could see Karen leaning forward in her chair, watching me intently. She was nervous. Good. She should be. I stood when it was my turn, walking up to the podium with calm confidence. No dramatics, no gestures, just the facts. "Your Honor," I began, "today I stand before you not just as a homeowner, but as a resident of this community who has had enough. I have evidence here that shows Karen, the president of this HOA, has used her position to illegally manipulate the system for personal gain. She has pushed families out of their homes, used fraudulent fines, and, as seen today, illegally sealed my property in an attempt to reclaim what was lost by her family due to their own financial mismanagement. The courtroom was silent as I laid out the evidence. Emails from residents, letters threatening eviction, records showing Karen's family's debt, and testimonies from the people she had wronged. The pieces all fit together perfectly. Karen's lawyer tried to interject, but I wasn't having it. Your Honor, Karen's actions are not isolated incidents. She has systematically used the HOA's influence to force people into foreclosure, bully them into leaving their properties, and manipulate the system to take what doesn't belong to her. I pointed to Karen, who was sitting with her head slightly bowed, her once confident posture completely shattered. This is not about a fence or a mailbox. This is about greed. This is about taking what isn't hers and ruining people's lives in the process. Karen's lawyer continued to protest, but it was clear he was grasping at straws. The weight of the evidence was too strong. I could see the tide turning in the room, and for the first time, Karen knew she was losing. The judge leaned forward, looking at Karen directly. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" he asked. Karen's face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but paused, realizing that no matter what she said, the damage had already been done. She didn't know who she was up against. She thought she was above the law, but now she was staring at the undeniable truth. I stayed silent, watching as Karen's face crumpled. The mask of arrogance she had worn so long was gone, replaced by the cold reality of her actions catching up with her. She had no more excuses, no more manipulation. She was about to face the consequences. The judge called for a recess, and I left the courtroom to let the weight of the proceedings settle. I didn't need to be in the room when the final decision was made. I knew Karen's downfall was inevitable. The facts spoke for themselves. When I returned, the judge had made his ruling. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as he spoke. "Karen," the judge began, "you have abused your position, misused the HOA for personal gain, and intentionally harmed multiple individuals in this community. Your actions are not only unethical, but they are also illegal. You will face the consequences of your actions, including criminal charges and the restitution of property to those wronged under your rule." The room went quiet as the judge's words sank in. Karen's mouth hung open in disbelief. She had expected to get away with it. She had expected to intimidate people into submission. But now, she was the one who had been outplayed. As the bailiff moved to escort her from the courtroom, Karen turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. You're nothing but a traitor," she hissed, her voice shaking. I just smiled. "No, Karen, I'm someone who believes in justice. Something you clearly don't understand." As Karen was led away, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't just about getting my property back. It was about restoring fairness to a community that had been taken advantage of for so long. I had used the law not to fight back with anger or violence, but with the cold, undeniable truth. The following weeks were filled with quiet triumph. Karen was forced to pay restitution for the damage she had done, both financially and emotionally, to the residents of the community. The HOA was restructured, and a new leadership was put in place. People who understood the responsibility of their role and who didn't abuse their power. I returned home to my family, knowing we were safe. My son's 4th birthday was a reminder of what was important. The joy and laughter we had shared were things that couldn't be stolen or manipulated. And now, our home was truly ours again. As for Karen, she disappeared from the public eye. Rumors spread that she fled the country to escape further scrutiny, but the damage had already been done. Her reign of terror was over. If you were as shocked as we were by Karen's downfall, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories of justice being served. Do you think Karen got what she deserved? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Want to hear more stories where the powerful are taken down by the law? Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And if you've ever had to fight back against an unjust system or been wronged by someone in power, drop your story in the comments. We'd love to hear how you took a stand and got justice.